Hello and welcome to Counterpoint. I'm your guest host, Michelle Simard, and today I'd like to delve into the topic of post-truth and fake news. More specifically, I want to discuss how the problem of fake news is still prevalent in 2022, and what can people do to protect themselves from this challenging dilemma our society is still facing. Today I have Chartoth Bharti, a privacy, AI ethics, and technology lawyer who is a senior consultant at Ernst & Young Canada. Welcome, Chartoth.
Hi, Michelle. Thanks for having me.
Oh, no, thank you. As you know, Chartoth, fake news exists across a variety of media, including print, TV, radio, and online broadcasting. Much of that recent discourse around fake news involves social media platforms and how fake news is spread through these platforms, such as Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, Twitter, and the like. So Chartoth, given all this, what is fake news for our viewers?
So, fake news is a major problem as we see it, as you described it today, but at the heart of it, it is characterized as two things: misinformation, disinformation that's spread through online or other social platforms. And I think at the heart of this issue is technology that's propagating this, and our susceptibility and our propensity to believe certain things that might further our worldview and might further our biases. And a lot of the technology is now enabling this fake news, such as deep fakes and AI being manifested in form of deep fakes is enabling this technology a lot.
Yes. You used two words that were very interesting. And as you know, I'm also a lawyer who specializes in privacy and cybersecurity. Misinformation and disinformation. Can you explain the difference? Because I know many people don't understand the difference between them.
Well, there's a difference of intent. So at times you can pass on information that you did not know was not in fact true. And then at times you can pass on information that can be deliberately spread by certain parties for whatever reasons. And that's the intentional angle that comes in, the difference between misinformation and disinformation.
Meaning if you're spreading disinformation, you know it's not correct information, but you have the intent to still spread it anyways, correct?
Absolutely. So there can be a lot of motivations for that, especially in terms of, in political advertising, we see that a lot. So,
so give us some examples. Give us some examples.
So state actors are known to do this in interference in elections in different jurisdictions. For instance, you can look at the U.S. elections, the midterm elections that are coming in, and across jurisdictions, where governments are specifically guarding against interference from third-party actors who might willfully spread misinformation and disinformation around key election issues. Platforms like Twitter and Facebook are now actively flagging certain state actors and state media channels as such to let people know that this information is coming from specific actors.
So when you use the term state actors, an example, like such as Russia.
That could be one. I think there is a lot of speculation as to what actually is coming from state actors and what isn't. And
yes.
But state actors can be far and wide, including Russia.
Yeah, so just for our viewers to understand what state actors are, and do you have any other examples? Like you mentioned earlier a little bit about advertising. Like sometimes there's an intent of why misinformation is spread.
Right. So to a large extent, election outcomes. So when we speak of AI, there's an erosion of trust in media institutions with fake news. A lot of people are inclined to believe what they think is true and disregard anything that they think it's not. And that's how a lot of policymakers are now speaking to technology companies and saying the way that your technology runs is actually impacting how we run the country. Because the issues that people care about substantially change. So issues, for instance, about the economy could take less precedence as opposed to issues of racial violence or other political issues that take center stage and impact people and generate and incite hatred amidst them.
Oh, okay. So really, at the end of the day, what people really need to figure out is that One, what do they see is misinformation or is it disinformation? I mean, either or still makes it not relevant news. So really, this comes to the point of where do people go? But we're going to pick that up right after this break. Welcome back. As we discussed in the first segment of the show, fake news can originate from any number of sources, and it's shared across different platforms. One of the hallmarks of fake news is that the content looks as though it's produced by reliable news outlets. Mr. Bharti, how do AI tools and resources perpetuate these problems?
So, as you mentioned, Michelle, a lot of the content is indistinguishable from what might look like an actual credible video or a news article. So, large language models, which have billions of parameters and trillions of parameters, which is data points, and they're collecting this information off of the internet by data scraping and unsupervised learning, as they call it. Essentially, what that does is it creates, with a single prompt, an article or an essay that can sound and look exactly like what a human would create. Along with that, there's deepfakes, where somebody's face can be morphed onto a video and they can actually be presented as talking and saying things that they didn't actually say.
The example would be the Nancy Pelosi.
That's one example. There was a very famous example of
Yes.
An Obama video as well, which went viral. So political leaders, whose words have a lot of weight, they could be made to look like they're saying something and conveying a message which they didn't actually convey. So that could polarize a lot of people. That's one. And there's also research to suggest that fake news travels up to 6 times faster than the truth. And for example, in a chain, it would a news which comprises of the truth would go up to 10 chains, basically shared 10 times. But a piece of news which is fake would be amplified to the tune of about 19 times. That's almost double the propagation. That's because of bots that are used in social media platforms, which run on algorithms.
Explain to our viewers what bots are.
Right. So bots are users which are fake. They're automated. They're used to propagate content by cut copying and pasting and just retweeting, for instance. And what they're saying is amplifying the message, and it shows up often as trends on Twitter, for instance, or on Facebook.
Yes, but bots also can be used for useful tools. And to be an example of such is like when someone goes to a website that they want to purchase something, and you have a little icon that pops up and says, "What I may help you with." That 90% of the time, I would say even more, is a bot. So there's good and bad uses for bots, but the one that you're talking about is obviously used for nefarious reasons. So given all this and the technology that's out there, that's very clear. What can be done to tackle these issues with AI and misinformation and disinformation? Because clearly, it's like you said, the rate is exponential compared to the rate of movement for real news.
Absolutely. So it's important to realize that AI is at the root of the problem and also the solution. So because of the large amounts of content that's posted on these platforms, it's impossible for a human to actually go through all of that and weed out what's true and what's not. And then there's the subjective problem of knowing what's the truth and what's not. But AI propagates this content, and at the same time, the moderation and the correction of this content or removal would also be dependent on AI. So AI tools are used by social media platforms to weed out and identify and weed out content, which is misinformation or disinformation in its nature. So what's also, and another point is it's important to realize that the online misinformation has real harms in the real world. So a lot of the stuff that we read online, we might think it's harmless, just somebody wrote it, but eventually if it propagates far enough and enough people believe it, that can lead to real world violence, real world harms, and there's ample examples of that. What we can do is build trust in AI to make sure that humans are overseeing what AI is doing, to make sure that our algorithms in social media platforms, for instance, are written in a responsible way, which makes sure and which accounts for the fact that there can be human biases in the algorithm and in the people reading the content which the algorithm recommends.
Yeah, exactly. I think we know as being privacy specialists that there's numerous articles out there talking about the inherent biases that algorithms have, and that even those humans who oversee it. I mean, now they even come up with something where at MIT, where it's kind of like a jury in regards to algorithms to make sure that any inherent biases are not there. But yeah, so like as you said, AI is part of the problem, if not the major component, but also can be the major solution. So we're going to get right back to it after this break. Welcome back. So, as you know, Charath, following a global trend from the European Union, the United States, Canadian legislators appear poised to move beyond their policy frameworks developed by both private and public bodies. And they're going to adopt hard law on artificial intelligence, which I'm pretty happy about. As you know, Bill C-27 was introduced this year on June 16th, and it was past its first reading. It's included in the Digital Charter Implementation Act 2022. And as you know, this act contains 3 acts, which is really ambitious for the government to do. And the one that deals with artificial intelligence is called Artificial Intelligence and Data Act. And I'm just going to call it AIDA for short. It would be the first law in Canada that would regulate artificial intelligence. And the stated aim of AIDA is to regulate international and interprovincial trade and commerce in artificial intelligence systems. And it requires a lot of adoption to mitigate risk and harm and bias outputs to high-impact systems. So that's a lot of information for people, everyday people, to understand. So my question to you is this new legislation in Canada going to tackle some of the current issues with misinformation and disinformation? And can you talk about the legislation a little bit more? Because it's pretty intense and it's quite ambitious.
Absolutely, it's a groundbreaking legislation, perhaps only the third major jurisdiction to implement something like this, if we consider the US as well, then 4. But broadly, what it does is to build trust in AI systems for the public to use. So there's a lot of provisions around transparency of how the algorithms work, what's the logic behind them, and also around audits, for instance. That's a major area where we can ensure that the systems are built with the right sort of perspectives in mind, and they realize that there can be pitfalls when those are actually deployed. And apart from that, it makes sure that the minister has powers to regulate, the use of these systems. It's still at a draft stage, but the bill is undoubtedly doing some groundbreaking work that absolutely needs to be done with regards to the regulation of AI in Canada.
Agreed. I think, as you mentioned in our previous segment, AI is part of a major part of the problem for misinformation and disinformation, but it also can be the solution. But I think the only way it can be the solution is there has to be regulation. Like with everything in life, there has to be parameters and boundaries in which things can expound. If there's not, then it becomes the wild, wild west and anything goes. And frankly, that's what's been happening. So it's much needed. The question is it enough? And what do you think some of the problems might be? And what do you think was left out? Because, I got my own thoughts on that, and I'll give them to you in a moment. But seriously, what do you think could be done more? And I know it's only its first draft, though.
Yeah, there's legislations to which we can compare this to. So there's obviously the European Union legislation, and the European Union has proposed an Artificial Intelligence Act as well. That act, in its scope, it's still unclear what will come out because it's also at a draft stage and several amendments have been moved. But at the base of it, there are some things which additionally this legislation could abuse. For instance, a regulatory sandbox. At the end of the day, what we're talking about when we talk about AI is a conversation between businesses and governments. And obviously, a big part of that conversation will be citizens, but the governments are representing the citizens' interests. And a regulatory sandbox, which basically means that you can try out the technology before you deploy it, is one essential thing that I think could be added here. A lot remains to be seen in terms of what will be the core provisions of the Act. A lot remains with the minister in terms of regulations to be made specifically. And the the act governs high risk systems, and those high risk systems per se have certain requirements that they need to follow. A lot can be done in that space, but it's not been embedded into the legislation yet. That remains to be seen. It will come in the form of of rules and guidelines that are issued by the government.
Yeah, so you brought up the regulatory sandbox, which I think actually is an excellent idea. But obviously, the counterpoint to that for many businesses is that, well, that's just a further delay in order to try to get their products out, and all they're saying is it'll just be more red tape. So, well, it has some benefits. Businesses may not be so inclined because they don't see it being advantageous, so they may go to other jurisdictions to do it. And at the end of the day, we don't want to not have business within our country. So do you think there could be some little middle ground that we could have, that we could see something? In just one point.
Absolutely. So I think it can be a massive advantage for businesses to know that what can be the real world issues with the deployment of the technologies. AI as a technology, the nature of it, it's hard to predict what happens when it's deployed. So
okay,
there
hold
is
on,
an advantage.
Hold on. I want to carry that point, but we just have to take a break right now. And welcome back. So Charles, right before the break, you were just finishing your point.
Right. So I think there's value in a conversation which is in the form of a regulatory sandbox. Businesses can know what the technology in its deployment form will look like, which as a technology for AI, it's very hard to predict what happens when you actually deploy it. So there is a specific use case in the context of AI for regulatory sandboxes. That's what I was saying, Michelle. Thanks.
Oh, yeah, perfect. So, as you know, there's a lot of information for our viewers to take in and consider, and we've talked about many things, especially this new AI legislation, which I agree it can be extremely beneficial. But I also want to make sure that we have businesses stay in this country and look at this country as a place that they can develop and grow them, so long as there's some framework. So, what do you think are the 3 key takeaways our viewers should consider when discerning between fake news and journalistic news? How do they know?
Right. So I think one of the key things is to pause before you actually share, right? So that'd be one key takeaway. A lot of the social media companies are doing it where they're asking readers if they're sharing the article just by reading the headline to check and actually read the article and what it says. That's one. 2, it's very important to know that all of us are vulnerable to this, right? It's not that one of us is impervious to misinformation and disinformation and we can discern it at the go. What we will need is specific training by policymakers, by social media platforms to detect such news. So social media platforms, tech companies can actually step up and take up the mantle on this front and guide people to what can be the truth and what cannot.
Can you clarify that a bit? Because I'm not quite understanding. You're saying that legislators should provide education to people in regards to knowing the difference?
I think a lot can be done, not just with legislators, with civil society in terms of sharing news, right? So knowing what you're sharing, reading it thoroughly, and that's probably the only defense against it, because as we discussed, it looks increasingly indistinguishable, right? And
yes.
Also checking the sources. So the mantle essentially falls on the individual, but the technology companies, the policymakers, and civil society can step in. Why it's important to do so is that a lot of people are vulnerable, especially, for instance, the children in our society.
Yes.
They also access these platforms and they're also vulnerable to a lot of misinformation, and they could be growing up in a very polarized society if they're not careful.
Well, in my personal opinion, I think that sometimes we'd have to look a little bit to history and to see before, the Gutenberg press and how media, like there was history books, and Herodotus and his histories, which is regarded as one of the most infamous type of historians and history books out there, is what he did is that he would look at all different sources and see if he found common facts. And if he found common facts, then he would be saying this is more inclined to being accurate and proper way to have this explain this event. And so I think for our viewers that I agree with you. Stop, pause, read, and also look at the source, because that's very important. But also look at other sources and see if there's a commonality and a thread. And I think that can be a really helpful tool for many of our viewers, because as I speak to so many people, people are just confused. They don't know the difference between real news and fake news. And it's very discernible. I've even had some times where someone sent me something and I responded back and said, that's fake news. And they're like, no, it's not. I then had to look and dig a little further, and I'm like, it wasn't. But, sometimes I'm also quick to do it. So given that, how long do you think fake news will last, and are you optimistic about the future?
I am optimistic about the future, Michelle, primarily because I see a lot of the responsible AI movement coming in. The way, as we discussed, to govern this is also in AI as much as the problem is rooted in it. So if trusted AI takes up the way that it's taking up, and it's a very, very fledgling industry at this point, but it's picking up, and people and technology and society at large is paying attention to this issue.
Well, thank you. I'm also optimistic myself, so let's see what happens. And while I'm not a huge fan of more regulation, I do think parameters and boundaries are needed. So thank you very much. I really appreciate your time. You provided great advice for our viewers, so thank you.
Thank you for having me.
While countries like Canada, the US, and the European Union may enact legislations that may assist people with privacy, AI, and misinformation, these are only tools that people can utilize. What is needed right now is more education for people to discern what is real and what is not. I hope this show assisted you, the viewers, of what to look for when it comes to fake news. The only way humanity beats fake news is to understand it, resist it, and conquer it. Some food for thought. Thanks, and have a great day.